later on, sooner than later though, is this idea that psychology and spirituality parallel in so many ways. In fact, you could even say that spirituality for Western culture is psychology. That's for a lot of us, that's the closest spiritual experience we have, is seeing our therapist or going to freshman psychology class and learning about these concepts of our behavior and brain, and all of a sudden we become self-aware. And if you've been through any sort of spiritual process or read about spirituality, aside from the most dogmatic, I guess, you would find that even in the most dogmatic, rather, that a lot of all spirituality, if not all of it, is about self-awareness. And if you think about it, self-awareness is basically psychology. Only in spirituality, the motivation is spiritual, and in psychology or in the sciences, the motivation is something empirical or material, as much as they can prove it. So, there's this one concept that both spiritualists and scientists use that I think is so key to understanding a lot of what's happening in behavioral sciences or self-awareness or spirituality, and even more so to understanding how to gain peace in your life. And that is this idea of ego. And because we use this word consistently in just everyday life, this word gets misused basically, or it strays from its more deeper elements that it's supposed to mean. And so we call people egotistical or egomaniacs, things of that nature, and we're trying to disparage someone's character. Basically, what we're trying to say is they're conceited or self-serving or self-centered. And so when we use it like that, I'm not saying we're using it wrong, but this is what we're trying to say, is that that person, when we say is egotistic, we're usually meaning that they're either extremely self-centered, extremely conceited, something of that nature. When a psychologist like Freud, who was one of the first to use this word in that realm in science, and is certainly the foundations of modern clinical psychology, as well as any sort of therapeutic psychology, pretty much anything aside from evolutionary psychology, I would assume. And then on the spiritual side, using the word ego as well would be something like ACIM, who uses the most or makes the biggest science out of it. That's a Course in Miracles, oftentimes abbreviated ACIM. And if you've never been familiar with this book, both are must, obviously, studies. Most people have seen a little bit of Freud. Very few people have seen ACIM, so I encourage you to take the time to really make that a part of your life and read it at some point. In both cases, they're sort of talking about the same thing, though. Essentially, the theory is that you have at least, and I'm just going to stick to two because I think there's only two, but there's some theories that are leading us now beyond, and we're not talking about schizophrenia in any way, but that the basic human behavior, the basic human mind is made up of at least two voices. And I'm just going to stick to two, so I'm going to stop saying at least. And the one we're obviously concerned with is this voice coming from the ego. And that voice is different than your voice. And I'll prove that again at the end of this explanation, but essentially the real proof of this, that the ego is not your voice, is that you listen to the ego talk to you. And you'll see that in just a second. And so if you're the listener, then obviously your true voice is being quiet and you're listening to something in your head. So what is that? Well, as you read these explanations, the best way to think about it is it's a screensaver, if you will. So whenever you're not consciously thinking, and consciously thinking would be like singing a song in your head, or figuring out a math problem, or doing a video like I'm doing, trying to explain something to someone where you're very in tune to what you're doing, that's conscious thinking. But when you fall into zombie mode, and you like driving, and you go daydreaming, or you go into autopilot, as they call it, or whatever that alpha mode is that we talk about, or actually it's the beta mode that we talk about, sort of a low frequency, low thought pattern, and you're not consciously thinking about anything, that's when the screensaver pops up, known as the ego. Now, it can also be likened to dreams, if you will. So when you fall asleep, you're no longer consciously thinking. Something has to come on into your brain, because basically in this existence, in this universe as I see it, entropy is always happening, so nothingness never happens, if that makes any sense. And so when you're not consciously thinking, something has to go on in there. When you're dreaming, obviously it's a lot more psychedelic. You have a lot less control. It seems to be when you're awake and you daydream or you fall into that autopilot, it has to be more practical because you're so submerged into that reality of being awake on the freeway, that it can't be super psychedelic and imagining yourself like flying off a cliff in your underwear, because that could cause you to wreck, obviously. And your mind is meant to keep you alive, and the only reason for the screensaver is really to keep your mind awake. But unfortunately, I don't know if it is because of some sort of genetic Anunnaki, fallen angel, or whatever the case may be, or just the constant abuse and torture of humanity through time. Whatever that case may be, that screensaver, especially when you're awake, has just become a complete asshole, basically. And all it does is create problems for you to solve, endless problems. Like whenever you accomplish something, it's moving on to the next task and saying, now we got to do this, and you're short of this. It reminds you of all of your deficiencies. It's basically your biggest critic. It is constantly reminding you what you're late for, what you need to improve on. It's sort of like that friend that you hate to hang out with because it's constantly giving you advice and making you feel like an asshole. Like, why am I not just good enough as I am? That's your ego, okay? And you can see how that's very different from how we use it in everyday use, where when we say someone's very egotistical, they seem very confident. In this case, if you're getting beat up by your ego, then you're basically a slave to your own criticism. And if you're not conscious of it, that's really easy to do, because basically you fall into that pattern or that daydream mode, and you start hearing these thoughts. They sound like your voice. They're coming from your mind, so you think they're very reasonable, and they're filled full of thought that comes from all your lifetime and knowledge. But the truth is you're not controlling them at all, so they're completely random like a dream, only they seem to try to keep you in the same realm so you don't wreck your car. So essentially, true, it's completely random, and so you got to be very conscious of it and say, okay, here's these thoughts in my head, and they're making me feel really bad, or they're making me feel incompetent, or wanting, what's the word I'm looking for, they're making me feel less, they're making me feel invaluable, basically. If I was Thomas the Train, they would make me feel unuseful. And so in that regard, you have to ask yourself, you have to be vigilant in your mind and say, is this a true thought? Is this real? Am I not useful? My mind is telling me right now, because I was late for dinner the last 3 nights for my family get-together or whatever, that, I'm less of a human being and I really got to work on that. Do I really need to work on that? I mean, it's fucking bullshit. Like, who cares at the end of the day? This is certainly not the most important thing. If I start consciously thinking, that will go way in the back of my mind, and I'll start thinking about, wow, you know what? I can make money this way. I can learn this new music. I've been thinking about this one philosophical thought. All the things that really matter in life, as I see it. Certainly not showing up, or whatever that thought is, not losing enough weight fast enough. Whatever those criticisms, those problems that are showing up in your mind are. If you're conscious of them, you can say, "Oh, that's just the screensaver." Okay, those aren't necessarily real thoughts. Is there sometimes truth there? Well, sure, absolutely. As my brother says, all criticism just makes you stronger. But if you keep listening to that voice and keep giving it a lot of credence, it will lead you down a path of depression. Certainly a lot of a lack of self-appreciation, self-love, and a lot of pain. What you will realize, hopefully, sooner than later is, while we might not understand the law of attraction, and there's been a lot of misinformation, or just bad explanations of it, if you can condition your mind, and this has been proven over and over again, if you can condition your mind to expect certain things, it will get them. That is what MK Ultra is based on. That's what all torture is based on. Okay, and on the other side, that is obviously what success is obviously based on. Most of the time, when it's not been through corruption, spiritual success, whatever the case may be. They've conditioned their mind to expect a certain type of life, okay? And that's different from just wanting it. Conditioning your mind to expect it. Okay? And that's why so many of these things that try to tap into that involve a lot. So at the end of the day, the important thing right now is just to understand this idea of this word ego, in that the ego is not you. It's another voice in your head.